This is Focus on Africa. I'm Laquessa Burak. Our top stories. Security forces in Mozambique are accused of serious human rights violations in the restive northern Cabo Delgado province. We've got the latest. Widespread flooding hits much of the Sahel region. We report from Sudan, which has seen its worst floods since records began. Horrific scenes as thousands of people are left without shelter after a fire devastates the largest migrant camp in Greece. Also in the programme, the presidential third term syndrome. We examine why some leaders hang on to power against their country's constitution, what safeguards are in place, and we also ask, why aren't they working? Hello and welcome to Focus on Africa, coming to you from BBC World News. We're going to start our programme today in Mozambique, where security forces have been accused of serious human rights violations in response to a growing jihadist rebellion. The rights group, Amnesty International, says it has verified videos from the northern Cabo Delgado province, which shows the attempted beheading and torture of prisoners who in the footage are referred to as Al-Shabaab, which is the local name for the Islamist militants. Now, I've got to give you a graphic violence warning here because you're about to hear some descriptions and also some of the images which we've had to blur. So, what we see here are, with arms tied behind their backs, some prisoners who are naked are then beaten with sticks and also rifles. A soldier in the footage is seen and heard cheering on his colleagues. And there's one colleague who's then filmed cutting a knife off, or using a knife to cut off a victim's ear. BBC has also seen photos showing men wearing the uniforms of the Mozambican army and an elite police unit, carrying out what Amnesty International calls acts of unspeakable cruelty. Now, fighting between opposition groups and civilians in the region first broke out back in 2017. So some graphic images there. Let's discuss the situation a little bit further now with David Machinye. Thank you very much for joining us. You are the Southern Africa researcher at Amnesty International in Johannesburg, part of the team involved in this report. So some disturbing details, some of which we couldn't talk about, but tell us more about this video and what's been uncovered.
Thank you. It's a number of videos, in fact. They depict horrific incidents that are very painful to watch. These events have taken place during the months of April and May, when the Mozambican forces were involved in a counter-attack to reclaim the towns in northern Mozambique that had been occupied by the armed group. So in the videos, we see the detainees half naked, either in their upper or lower bodies, and they're tied with their hands at the back. And we see members of the armed forces in Mozambique beating the victims on the floor with sticks, with the guns, and also kicking them.
Okay.
And you can hear the screams of the detainees on the ground. Next, you also see images of a pickup truck full of bodies, approximately 15 bodies being transported, to a location for burial. Okay,
David, I'm going to stop you there because obviously what you're detailing, I think the viewers understand, is really quite graphic, quite horrific. You've been calling for both sides, really, but particularly the government forces, to observe human rights. And this is coming from, I believe, June. Why only now have we got this footage? And are they responding? Why aren't they responding?
Well, this is not the first time that we have called upon the government of Mozambique to respect and protect human rights. This is one of the times that we have done so. We expect to hear from the government of Mozambique, But if we don't, we will continue to call upon them to investigate these incidents shown in the videos and bring those responsible to justice. For over 15 years now, we have seen various violations and abuses of human rights. And throughout this period, we have called upon the Mozambican government to conduct impartial, swift, and transparent investigations.
David, I suppose part of the solution is trying to work out what the source of the conflict is. Why are people fighting in this region? What is it about this region? It never gained this much attention.
Well, it never gets this much attention because the government in Mozambique, first of all, makes it very difficult for the media, for researchers and human rights organizations to reach the area. There's a great deal of disenfranchisement, of expropriation of land. Ever since the discovery of mineral resources, people have been forcibly removed from their land on which they have depended for centuries for food, water, housing, medicinal plants, their burial sites, and so on. And they have been left practically with nothing. So this has created a lot of dissatisfaction, and it was therefore easy for recruiters to come into the villages in those rural areas and recruit young people. These are grievances that should be addressed not only through armed forces, violence. It's not possible to solve these problems by violence.
All right, so it sounds like, sorry, David, just trying to get as much in as we can. It sounds like this comes down to that traditional, that worn-out story of a natural resource land grab, essentially. There are 2 points I'd just like you to clarify. The first off is, who exactly is this group? And is it true that the government has also been using mercenaries?
Well, it's true the government has been using mercenaries. First, there were the Russians, and now we have a mercenary group that comes from South Africa, and we have seen a lot of complaints and condemnation to resorting to mercenaries. These young people are from those villages that feel disaffected, they are unemployed, they lack formal education, and therefore they cannot even be absorbed in the burgeoning mining industry and the gas industry. So they are redundant practically, and they are left landless. These are local individuals, although there is a tendency of pointing the finger outside. The problems, greater part of them, are from within.
Okay, David Matsinye, thank you very much for that explanation of what was found in your report. Thank you.
Thank you.
Speaking to us from Johannesburg. Now, widespread floods have hit much of central, west and northeastern Africa. In Sudan, the Nile has risen to its highest level in over a century. The floods are yet another blow for a country struggling to emerge from conflict, political upheaval and economic turmoil. Now, the Sudanese government has declared a state of emergency. The BBC's senior Africa correspondent, Anne Soy, has the report.
This is the island of Tuti, where the Blue and White Nile rivers converge in Sudan. The country is experiencing the worst flooding since records began. Satellite images show just how bad the situation is. This was before the rains. Now see how Sudanese farms on the banks of the Nile have disappeared underwater. Lives have been lost, livelihoods destroyed, and homes damaged.
I just took my children and left. The beds and everything are still inside. All I took were some clothes. When the neighbors wanted to save the rest of the furniture from the homes, the water level increased again.
The government has declared Sudan a natural disaster zone, and water levels continue to rise, putting more people at risk.
We are trying to convince the people of Tuti Island to leave, but they won't. We tried to convince them to save their lives. We told them that people will stand by them and that the houses can be replaced.
There's a scramble to stop nature's destruction. Some areas of the largely desert country are getting swamped for the first time in living memory. And important archaeological sites are under threat. It's not just in Sudan and neighboring countries. Across Central and West Africa, more devastation. The outskirts of Senegal's capital, Dakar, remain inundated days after exceptionally heavy rainfall. The country recorded in just one day more rain than they usually receive in a wet season lasting about 3 months. Residents are desperate to minimize destruction. In this community, they are trying to save their health center as fears of disease outbreaks increase. More rains are predicted to continue pounding all the affected areas on the continent in the coming weeks. There is no respite in sight. Anne Soy, BBC News.
You're watching Focus on Africa, coming to you from BBC World News. Let's just take a look at some other stories making the headlines now. And the body behind the Oscars has set out new criteria which films hoping to compete for the Best Picture award will have to meet in the hope of boosting representation and inclusion. From 2025, specific numbers of cast and crew must be filled by people of colour, women, people with disabilities, or those from the LGBTQ+ community. The failure to nominate black or minority actors back in 2016 led to a furious backlash, with film stars boycotting the ceremony and the growth of the Oscars So White movement. Zimbabwe has banned mining within its national parks with immediate effect. The move follows an outcry over coal prospecting permits that reportedly had been given to 2 Chinese companies in the Hwange National Park in the west of the country. Now, Hwange is home to one of the largest remaining elephant populations in the world. Environmentalists had warned of environmental degradation if the mining were to go ahead. South Africa's double Olympic 800-metre champion, Caster Semenya, has accused World Athletics of being on the wrong side of history. It comes after a Swiss federal tribunal ruled on Tuesday that it supported a decision requiring women with high testosterone to take medication to reduce their levels in order to compete internationally in mid-distance events. It now looks impossible for Semenya to defend her title in Tokyo next year. You're watching Focus on Africa, coming to you from BBC World News. Still to come, these 2 West African leaders want third terms. We look at why term limits are extended. Welcome back. You're watching Focus on Africa with Lukwasa Burak. Now, a humanitarian disaster is how the situation following a fire on Greece's largest migrant camp on the island of Lesbos is being described. The comments from the German foreign minister follow the blaze overnight, which largely destroyed the Moria camp, leaving up to 13,000 people homeless. Now, Moria, which was home to migrants from 70 countries, including Africans, is notoriously overcrowded, accommodating 4 times its official capacity. Now, there had been anger over strict quarantine procedures after dozens of people there tested positive for COVID-19. The cause of the fire isn't immediately clear, but the Greek migration minister has claimed that it was started by migrants, possibly accidentally. A state of emergency was also declared and assistance offered from the EU. Our correspondent, Mark Lebel, has more.
Helpless as their homes burn.
My house is finished. Asphalt, many, all finished.
Thousands of migrants in this crammed refugee camp of makeshift tents and shipping containers are being told to evacuate. Strong winds are hindering fire crews battling to contain the blaze. Local residents are now witnessing homeless asylum seekers with nowhere to turn, with reports many are being held on a highway.
These people, they don't have a place to stay tonight. It's about, here in front of me, it's about 1,000 people that they have everything, the belongings, and they are sitting on the street. If you go till Mytilene, you drive to Mytilene, It's 15 kilometers, and all the way you will see people walking with the luggage.
Tensions have been rising in recent days as residents objected to their proximity to dozens who've tested positive with coronavirus. The whole camp was under a strict quarantine. Authorities had promised to improve segregation conditions after a medical charity had warned of disastrous consequences after the forced closure of their relief centre there in July. It's not the first fire that's broken out at the camp. Aid agencies have repeatedly warned about the fragile situation. Today's fire will once again put the spotlight on this gateway to Europe for many of the world's migrants. Mark Lobel, BBC News.
Local elections have been held today in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia. The state governor claimed that they were historical and a vote for self-determination. There had been concern that the poll would lead to heightened tensions with Prime Minister Ahmed's government. He had to postpone this year's general election due to the coronavirus pandemic. Well, Kalkadan Yabutel has been monitoring how the day went for us from Addis.
Authorities here in Addis Ababa deem it illegal. Political elites in Tigray, however, call it the ultimate expression of people's constitutional rights. One thing uncontroversial about today's votes in Ethiopia's northernmost state is that they were peaceful. No incident was reported as people headed to some 2,600 polling stations. The region's electoral commission, tasked with conducting the votes, say that more than 2.7 million people were registered to vote. And many were seen lining up in front of polling stations hours before they were opened at 6 in the morning. 5 political parties have taken part in today's votes, including the ruling the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, TPLF, which has been in power since the early 1990s. Once a dominant force in Ethiopian politics, the TPLF refused to join Abiy Ahmed's Prosperity Party and has emerged as a strong opposition to the Nobel Peace Prize-winning Prime Minister's administration. Results are expected to be announced in the following days, but we will have to wait and see what the lasting impacts will be in the already fraught relationship between the federal and the regional governments. Kalkidan Ibeltal, BBC News, Addis Ababa.
Okay, we're going to focus on events in Guinea now, where a list of approved presidential candidates for October's poll will be announced later today. We know that one of those on the list will almost certainly be the current president, Alpha Condé, who became Guinea's first democratically elected president in 2010. But many in the country say that he is playing fast and loose with the very idea of democracy. In March, despite protests, he pushed through constitutional reform which effectively reset the presidential term counter, allowing him to stand for that third term. And he's not the only leader, actually, certainly in West Africa, who thinks it's best that they stay in charge, despite what the constitution says. For example, Ivory Coast President Alassane Ouattara will run for a third term in October. And all this comes just days after Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari. He's in the middle there. He's trying to referee things. And he warned those two men, please stick to your constitutional term limits, saying the issue repeatedly generates crisis and political tension in the ECOWAS region. So, does the continent have a bit of a problem with the third term? Let's discuss this further then. Adem Abibi is the Programme Officer with International IDEA. Now, this is an organisation that works to advance democracy globally, and I know that you advise on democratic governance and constitutional building, particularly across the Africa region. You're in The Hague. Thank you very much for joining us. First off, what is it about this elusive third term?
Thank you very much for having me. The challenge has always been, from experience in Africa, that politics is extremely personalized. For some incumbents, it's very difficult for them to imagine their party and even their country without them. So the tendency, it has happened quite often, and the Guinea and Ivory Coast are only the latest examples, is that incumbents think that the country could collapse, instability could come, and therefore they find ways to extend their terms. But in reality, it's them trying to change things that leads to instability.
Is that really what it's about? Because many people would say, no, it just comes down to power and greed.
Absolutely, that could be one possible explanation. But there is a tendency, it's not always greed alone that explains it. If you look at, for instance, Cote d'Ivoire, there's a lot of popular support for the president to remain. And in fact, the push for him to run for a third term came from his party initially, and then subsequently from a large group of people. So I think there's a tendency, not just among incumbents, but also the broader public, that certain things are better remaining the same.
So it's more a case of better the devil you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So what about then when we look at the things like the Constitution or regional bodies, let's say the AU, ECOWAS, how effective are they on guiding some of the leaders who will not let go?
Unfortunately, the African Union, ECOWAS, other regional organizations in Africa have been quite slow in establishing democratic alternation of power as a fundamental commitment. They tried to do it in 2015 in Burundi, but it failed, and it seemed like they have taken their lesson. So they have been extremely slow. And what that has done is that whenever you have more difficult situations, like across the border from Cote d'Ivoire and Guinea in Mali, the African Union has kind of lost credibility. If it cannot stand up to governments, to incumbents that want to stay forever, then it also would find it difficult to stop military leaders from overthrowing democratically elected governments. So I think the failure to have a very clear normative standard against third terms has created a problem.
Adem, I want to look at what happens when the leader, even after that third term, gets very comfortable and still doesn't want to leave. So let's look at the example of Uganda. 5 terms.
Unfortunately, it almost never stops at a third term. It almost always continues. And if you look at the president of Guinea, he's 82, Ouattara is 78. These are really old politicians. So they often end up, as Mo Ibrahim once said, they are leading us to their graves. So it's really time for the African Union, for ECOWAS, to push for clarity of norms in this regard and adopt democratic alternation of power as a fundamental principle of continental integration.
Very quickly, Adam, you said it's time for them to put this pressure on. It seems that a lot of these leaders just don't care. They're going to do things their way. Obviously, they've been in power. They know what's best for their country. Is there no sway that some of these bodies have?
They do have some sway. I think what they lack is consistency. They have never really pressured as a united front against leaders that try to tamper with term limits. If they do that, they definitely have sway. I think their rejection of any country from a regional body has definitely impact. It supports domestic movements in Cote d'Ivoire, in Guinea. There's a lot of movement that is against these attempts, and a continental regional support will definitely sway the balance in those contexts.
Adem, I had so many questions because I wanted to address what happens when you are there for too long. We've seen many economies decimated. But for now, thank you very much indeed. That's Adem Abibi speaking to us about that elusive presidential third term. That's it from us. As I said, you can find me on social media. I'm at Lakwesa Burak. From the team, cheerio.